Roman involvement in Judea began decisively in 63 BC, when the Roman general Pompey the Great intervened in a civil conflict between rival Hasmonean claimants, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. Although one Hasmonean faction invited Roman arbitration, Rome used the conflict to impose lasting political dominance rather than temporary mediation. Pompey entered Jerusalem and asserted Roman authority over the region. While Jewish religious institutions were left in place, political independence ended. From this point forward, Judea functioned within Rome's imperial system, subject to Roman military power and foreign oversight. In the decades that followed, Rome governed Judea primarily through client rulers rather than direct annexation. The most significant of these was Herod the Great, appointed king by the Roman Senate in 40 BC and installed militarily by 37 BC. This appointment occurred under the authority of Mark Antony and Octavian, following Parthian incursions that destabilized the eastern Roman provinces. Herod ruled until he died in 4 BC. His authority derived entirely from Roman backing. He was tasked with maintaining order, securing tax revenue, and suppressing unrest in a region that Rome regarded as politically sensitive. Herod's reign reshaped the political and social landscape of Judea. He undertook extensive building programs throughout the region, the most prominent of which was the expansion of the Jerusalem Temple, begun around 20 to 19 BC. This project transformed the temple into one of the largest sacred complexes in the eastern Mediterranean. While the renovation increased the temple's religious prestige, it also reinforced its role as a political and economic institution closely aligned with royal power. The temple functioned as the central site of sacrificial worship, pilgrimage, and legal adjudication. It served as a focal point for collective religious life and as an important interface between Jewish elites and Roman-backed rulers. Its authority was normative rather than universal and was openly rejected by some sectarian groups who denied the legitimacy of the Jerusalem priesthood. Temple influence was strongest in Jerusalem and Judea proper. In other regions, daily religious life operated with greater autonomy. After Herod died in 4 BC, his kingdom was divided among his sons. Herod Archelaus received Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. His rule proved unstable and was marked by unrest and administrative failures. Complaints from local elites led Rome to depose him in 6 AD. Judea was then placed under direct Roman administration, governed from Caesarea Maritima on the Mediterranean coast. From 6 AD onward, Judea was administered by Roman officials commonly referred to as prefects, though ancient terminology varies, and later sources sometimes use the term procurator. Modern scholarship applies prefect to the early governors for clarity. The title prefectus for this period is confirmed by inscriptional evidence, including the Pilate inscription discovered at Caesarea. These officials were responsible for tax collection, maintaining public order, and exercising judicial authority in capital cases. Roman governors generally avoided involvement in internal religious disputes, but intervened decisively when stability or imperial authority was threatened. One such governor was Pontius Pilate, who administered Judea from 26 to 36 AD. His tenure reflects the broader Roman approach to provincial governance: limited military presence, cooperation with local elites, and readiness to employ force when necessary. Roman troops in Judea were relatively few in number, but strategically positioned to respond quickly to unrest. Roman rule was experienced unevenly across the region. In Judea, Roman authority was more visible and direct. In Galilee, governance followed a different pattern. Galilee was ruled by Herod Antipas from 4 BC to 39 AD as a client tetrarch. Roman influence there was mediated through local rule rather than direct administration. Galilee was characterized by small agricultural villages, limited aristocratic presence, and greater reliance on itinerant teachers rather than temple-based authority. These differences shaped local social and religious life. Within this imperial framework, Second Temple Judaism was not a unified system. Jewish society in the late Second Temple period was internally diverse, structured around competing interpretations of law, authority, and religious obligation. The temple priesthood, often associated in later sources with the Sadducees, controlled sacrificial worship and held institutional authority in Jerusalem. Their power was tied to lineage, ritual control, and temple economics. Cooperation with Roman and Herodian authorities helped preserve their position and maintain public order. The Pharisees functioned primarily as teachers and interpreters of the law. They emphasized the study and application of Torah beyond temple ritual, extending religious observance into daily life. Their influence operated largely through communal instruction rather than political office. Other Jewish groups rejected the legitimacy of the Jerusalem priesthood entirely. Sectarian communities, known through texts later discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, withdrew from mainstream society and developed alternative communal structures. These groups emphasized strict discipline, communal ownership, and heightened expectations of divine intervention. Apocalyptic ideas were significant and well attested, though not universal. Many Jews believed history was moving toward divine judgment and restoration, shaped by centuries of foreign domination. Apocalyptic expectations are especially visible in surviving sources in part because such texts were more likely to be preserved than everyday religious instruction. These ideas varied widely and did not constitute a single movement. The concept of a Messiah was similarly diverse. Expectations included royal, priestly, prophetic, or combined figures. Some interpretations were symbolic and future-oriented. Others were explicitly political. There was no single, dominant understanding shared across Jewish society. Resistance to Roman rule occurred intermittently, but did not take the form of sustained rebellion before 66 AD. The Roman census conducted under Quirinius in 6 AD provoked unrest and became a lasting symbol of Roman intrusion. Such events contributed to tension without producing continuous revolt. Daily life for most inhabitants of Judea and Galilee centered on agriculture, local trade, and village-based social structures. Literacy was limited, but oral instruction played a central role in religious life. Teaching occurred in synagogues and informal gatherings. Roman roads and administrative networks connected Judea to the wider Mediterranean world, facilitating movement and communication. Within this historical environment, Jesus of Nazareth was born sometime before 4 BC, since Herod the Great died in that year. His early life unfolded under Herodian rule, while his public activity occurred under Roman prefectural governance. His movement operated entirely within Jewish society, using Jewish institutions, language, and expectations. Before 30 AD, there was no Christianity, no church, no canon, and no separate religious identity. There were Jewish teachers, followers, and disputes functioning under Roman power. Any later distinctions between Judaism and Christianity do not apply to this period. By the late 20s AD, Judea remained a Roman prefecture governed from Caesarea, with Pontius Pilate serving as prefect from 26 to 36 AD. Roman authority was exercised through limited military force, cooperation with local elites, and control over capital punishment. Jewish religious institutions continued to operate, but final jurisdiction in cases involving public order or potential sedition rested with Roman officials. It was within this administrative framework that Jesus of Nazareth was executed. The execution most plausibly occurred around 30 AD during Pilate's prefecture. While ancient sources differ in detail, there is broad agreement that the execution was carried out by Roman authority. The method, crucifixion, was a Roman punishment reserved for slaves, rebels, and those perceived as threats to public order. It was not a Jewish form of execution. The surviving sources do not permit a detailed reconstruction of the legal proceedings. The canonical Gospels were written decades later and reflect theological concerns alongside historical memory. Non-Christian references, such as those by Tacitus, confirm that Jesus was executed under Pilate's authority. What can be stated with confidence is limited but firm. The execution was Roman, public, and intended to neutralize a perceived disturbance. The removal of Jesus through execution eliminated the central figure around whom the movement had formed. Unlike later Christian narratives, this moment did not produce an immediate, clearly defined institution. Instead, it created a leadership vacuum. The survival of the movement depended on whether the organization could be maintained in the absence of its founder. In the immediate aftermath, leadership consolidated in Jerusalem, the religious and symbolic center of Jewish life. The earliest identifiable leaders were James, Peter, and John. James, identified in later sources as a relative of Jesus, emerged as a central figure in the Jerusalem community. Peter and John were associated with missionary activity and public teaching, though their exact roles are unevenly documented. This early leadership did not function as a formal hierarchy in the later ecclesiastical sense. There was no bishopric, no canon, and no standardized creed. Authority rested on proximity to Jesus, recognition by the community, and the ability to maintain cohesion. Decisions were made collectively, within a Jewish framework, and in continuity with existing religious practices. The Jerusalem group remained fully Jewish in identity and practice. Participation in temple worship continued. Observance of Jewish law was not abandoned. There is no evidence from this period of an attempt to create a new religion separate from Judaism. The movement functioned as a Jewish group centered on the belief that Jesus held a particular, elevated role within Israel's religious narrative. The execution did not immediately provoke Roman suppression of the group as a whole. Roman authorities were primarily concerned with maintaining order, not policing theological disputes. As long as the movement did not generate unrest or challenge Roman authority directly, it remained beneath the threshold of sustained imperial attention. The earliest phase after the execution was therefore characterized by structural survival rather than doctrinal expansion. The group gathered, taught, and interpreted events within categories already available in Jewish thought. Claims about Jesus' status developed within this environment, but they were not yet systematized or standardized. Geographically, the movement at this stage remained concentrated in Jerusalem and its immediate surroundings. Galilee, where Jesus had previously taught, did not immediately become the organizational center. Jerusalem's symbolic importance, combined with its existing networks of pilgrimage and teaching, made it the natural focal point for leadership. The continued presence of the temple shaped the movement's activities. Participation in pilgrimage festivals and public teaching placed the group within visible Jewish religious life. This visibility did not automatically translate into conflict with authorities, but it exposed the group to scrutiny from other Jewish leaders. The period following the execution also coincided with a broader atmosphere of tension in Judea. Roman administration remained sensitive to disturbances, especially during major festivals when Jerusalem's population expanded dramatically. Any group attracting attention in these contexts risked intervention if perceived as destabilizing. Within this environment, the early Jesus followers did not articulate a formal response to Roman authority. There is no evidence of organized political resistance. The movement's survival depended on maintaining internal cohesion while avoiding actions that would provoke repression. The execution also raised practical questions that had not previously required resolution. Without a living central figure, authority had to be negotiated. Disagreements over teaching, practice, and leadership would later emerge, but at this stage, the primary concern was continuity. It is important to note what did not yet exist. There was no concept of a universal church. There were no defined offices such as bishop, presbyter, or deacon in their later forms. There was no fixed body of authoritative writings. These developments belong to later decades. The earliest community operated through oral instruction, shared meals, and participation in existing Jewish institutions. Communication was local and personal. The movement's size during this period is unknown, but it was small enough to function without formal administrative structures. The execution of Jesus thus marks a historical turning point, not because it immediately created Christianity, but because it forced organizational adaptation. The movement either had to dissolve or reorganize. It chose reorganization. The categories used to interpret events, the institutions engaged, and the practices maintained all remained Jewish. Any later separation between Christianity and Judaism had not yet begun. At the same time, the execution introduced a new dynamic. Roman power had demonstrated its capacity to eliminate the movement's central figure. This fact shaped subsequent behavior, even if it did not produce immediate persecution. Awareness of Roman authority was unavoidable. The leadership that emerged in Jerusalem did so under these constraints. It balanced continuity with adaptation, maintaining fidelity to inherited practices while interpreting the execution in ways that sustained the group's identity. By the end of this initial post-execution phase, the movement had not expanded significantly beyond its original context. Its survival rested on a small group of leaders and adherents committed to preserving continuity. The conditions for future expansion, conflict, and division were present, but they had not yet fully developed. This period establishes the starting point of Christian origins in historical terms. Not a theology, not an institution, but an organized group continuing after the execution of its founder. In the years following the execution of Jesus, the Jesus-following movement remained centered in Jerusalem. This was not incidental. Jerusalem was the location of the temple, the focal point of Jewish religious life, and the place where the movement's earliest leadership had consolidated. The group operated openly within the structures of Second Temple Judaism and did not present itself as a separate religious body. Leadership in Jerusalem was exercised collectively, with James, Peter, and John emerging as the most visible figures. James, identified in multiple sources as a relative of Jesus, appears to have held particular authority within the Jerusalem community. His leadership was associated with continuity, stability, and adherence to Jewish law. The movement under his influence remained observant of Torah and integrated into Jewish communal life. The earliest Jesus followers did not abandon temple participation. There is evidence that they continued to attend festivals, engage in public teaching, and maintain ritual observance. The movement functioned as a Jewish group that held specific convictions about Jesus' role, not as a body attempting to redefine Jewish identity. At the same time, the movement did not remain confined to Jerusalem. Networks of travel, trade, and pilgrimage connected Judea to the wider Eastern Mediterranean. Jewish communities existed throughout Syria, Asia Minor, and Greece, providing established points of contact. These diaspora communities would become crucial to the movement's expansion. A decisive development occurred with the entry of Paul of Tarsus into the movement. Paul's involvement can be placed approximately between 34 and 36 AD, within a few years of the execution. Before his association with the Jesus followers, Paul was a diaspora Jew with Roman citizenship and training in Jewish law. His background differed significantly from that of the Jerusalem leadership. Paul's subsequent activity altered the trajectory of the movement. He engaged in teaching and organizing communities beyond Judea, particularly among non-Jews. These Gentile adherents did not share the same inherited relationship to Jewish law and custom. Their inclusion raised practical and doctrinal questions that had not previously required resolution. The central issue was not belief in Jesus' significance, but whether Gentile adherents were required to observe Jewish law, including circumcision, dietary regulations, and ritual practices. For the Jerusalem leadership, continued Torah observance was a given. For Paul, requiring full law observance from Gentiles threatened the viability of the mission outside Jewish contexts. These differing approaches did not immediately result in formal separation. Instead, they produced ongoing tension. Communities associated with Paul developed practices distinct from those maintained in Jerusalem. Communication between these groups occurred through travel, personal visits, and letters, but there was no central authority capable of enforcing uniformity. The Jerusalem leadership retained symbolic primacy. Its authority was grounded in proximity to Jesus' life and in its location at the heart of Jewish religious life. Paul did not deny this authority, but interpreted his own role as independently authorized within the movement. This dual structure, Jerusalem-based leadership and diaspora mission, introduced a structural strain that would shape subsequent developments. By the late 40s AD, these tensions reached a point that required direct negotiation. A meeting took place in Jerusalem, conventionally dated to around 49 AD. This gathering brought together representatives of the Jerusalem leadership and figures associated with the Gentile mission. The surviving accounts of this meeting are partial and reflect different perspectives. They agree, however, on the core outcome. Gentile adherents would not be required to undergo full conversion to Judaism. Certain practical expectations were articulated, but the requirement of circumcision was not imposed on non-Jews. This decision established provisional boundaries rather than a permanent resolution. It allowed the movement to continue expanding beyond Jewish contexts while preserving the authority of the Jerusalem leadership. The agreement did not eliminate disagreement. It formalized coexistence between different modes of participation within the same movement. The fragility of this arrangement became apparent almost immediately. Disputes over shared meals, social boundaries, and law observance continued to surface. These disputes did not yet produce schism, but they revealed the limits of unity within a movement lacking centralized enforcement mechanisms. Importantly, these conflicts unfolded within a Jewish framework. The question was not whether the movement would become a new religion, but how non-Jews could be integrated into what remained, in practice, a Jewish movement. The categories used to address these issues were inherited from Jewish law and tradition. Roman authorities did not intervene in these disputes. From the perspective of Roman administration, these were internal matters within Jewish communities and did not threaten public order. The movement remained small and localized enough to avoid sustained attention. By 49 AD, the Jesus-following movement existed as a network of communities connected by shared allegiance to Jesus, but divided in practice. Jerusalem retained moral and symbolic authority. Diaspora communities, especially those influenced by Paul, operated with increasing autonomy. This period marks the first durable structural divergence within the movement. It did not yet constitute a schism in the later sense. There were no excommunications, no rival institutions, and no formal declarations of separation. However, the conditions that would later produce irreversible division were now present. The movement had expanded beyond its original Jewish base. Authority was no longer concentrated in a single location. Practices differed from community to community. Unity depended on negotiation rather than enforcement. By the end of this phase, the movement was no longer defined solely by its Jerusalem origins. It had entered a transitional stage in which internal diversity became a permanent feature rather than a temporary complication. By the early 50s AD, the Jesus-following movement had expanded beyond its original geographic and social boundaries. Communities now existed across Syria, Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Achaia, with additional presence in Rome. This expansion did not occur under centralized direction. Instead, it followed existing Jewish diaspora networks, Roman roads, and maritime trade routes. The movement at this stage lacked any universally recognized institutional authority. There was no central governing body capable of regulating belief or practice across regions. Jerusalem retained symbolic importance, but practical authority varied from community to community. As a result, differences in teaching, discipline, and interpretation were inevitable. The earliest surviving documentary evidence from this period consists not of narrative accounts, but of letters. These letters, traditionally attributed to Paul of Tarsus, are the oldest extant Christian writings. Their composition can be dated with relative confidence between c. 50 and 62 AD, based on internal references and correlation with known historical events. The earliest of these letters is generally identified as 1 Thessalonians, written around 50 to 51 AD. It was addressed to a community in Macedonia that Paul had helped establish. The letter responds to specific concerns about behavior, communal order, and expectations regarding future events. Its tone is practical rather than doctrinal, indicating a community still in formation. Subsequent letters, including Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Philippians, and Romans, were written during the 50s AD. These texts address disputes over authority, ethical conduct, communal boundaries, and the relationship between Jewish law and Gentile participation. They were not intended as universal statements of belief. Each letter responds to local circumstances. These writings reveal a movement already marked by internal diversity. Practices differed from one community to another. Some groups maintained close ties to Jewish law and custom. Others, particularly those composed largely of Gentiles, operated with fewer connections to Jewish ritual life. Paul's correspondence reflects ongoing attempts to manage this diversity rather than eliminate it. The letters also demonstrate that doctrinal agreement was not assumed. Disputes are evident over leadership, behavior, and interpretation. Paul argues, persuades, and corrects, but he does not command through institutional authority. His influence depended on personal relationships, reputation, and continued communication. Importantly, these letters circulated independently of any fixed collection. There was no canon. Individual communities possessed copies of specific letters relevant to their situation. The idea of a unified body of authoritative writings did not yet exist. Textual authority remained localized and provisional. The absence of narrative accounts during this period is significant. No surviving gospel texts can be securely dated before 70 AD. This means that the earliest phase of the movement's expansion was shaped and documented through correspondence rather than biography. Memory of Jesus' life and teachings circulated orally, supplemented by written collections of sayings and interpretations that have not survived independently. This chronological fact has important implications. The movement developed its practices and internal structures before the production of narrative accounts of Jesus' life. Theology and organization emerged in response to lived circumstances rather than as applications of a fixed written story. The letters also reveal the growing distance between communities and the Jerusalem leadership. While Jerusalem remained symbolically important, practical decisions were increasingly made locally. Paul refers to Jerusalem figures, but he does not present them as direct administrators of diaspora communities. Tensions with Jerusalem-centered interpretations are particularly visible in Galatians, which reflects disagreement over the status of Gentile adherents and the authority of teachers associated with Jerusalem. These disagreements were not resolved through formal adjudication. They persisted alongside continued interaction. By the mid-50s AD, the movement had become textual mediated. Letters were read aloud in gatherings, copied, and shared. This practice introduced a new dynamic. Written argument could now shape communities across distance and time. Disputes that might once have remained local gained wider influence. The content of the letters shows that ethical instruction, communal discipline, and leadership roles were already being negotiated. Some communities struggled with factionalism. Others faced conflicts related to social status, economic inequality, or participation in surrounding civic life. These issues were addressed case by case. Roman authorities continued to show little interest in these developments. The movement remained a small and fragmented presence within the broader population. Where conflict arose, it was typically internal or involved disputes within Jewish communities rather than challenges to Roman governance. Paul's later letters, traditionally dated to the late 50s and early 60s AD, reflect increasing mobility and uncertainty. References to imprisonment suggest encounters with Roman authority, though not necessarily prolonged or systematic persecution. These episodes did not yet constitute a sustained imperial policy toward the movement. By c. 60 to 62 AD, Paul's activity appears to have reached its documented endpoint. Later tradition places his death in Rome during the reign of Nero, but the surviving evidence does not allow precise dating or circumstances. What matters historically is that his letters remained in circulation after his death, continuing to shape communities that he would no longer personally visit. At this stage, the Jesus-following movement existed as a network of assemblies connected by correspondence, shared practices, and personal relationships. There was no uniform doctrine, no centralized leadership, and no standardized scripture. Authority was negotiated, contested, and situational. The written record from this period captures a movement in transition. Oral tradition remained primary, but written texts were beginning to fix arguments and interpretations. These texts did not yet define orthodoxy, but they preserved disputes that would later be revisited and reinterpreted. The significance of this period lies in the fact that Christianity's earliest surviving texts are products of conflict and diversity, not unity. They document disagreement as a normal condition rather than an anomaly. By the end of this phase, the conditions were in place for a major transformation. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple would soon remove the movement's original symbolic center. In the absence of that center, written texts would assume a new level of importance. By the mid-60s AD, tensions between Roman authority and the population of Judea had intensified to a level not seen since the region came under direct Roman rule. Long-standing grievances over taxation, governance, and the conduct of Roman officials converged with internal divisions among Jewish leadership. These conditions formed the immediate background to the outbreak of large-scale conflict. In 66 AD, open revolt erupted in Judea. The immediate triggers included clashes between local populations and Roman authorities, disputes over temple administration, and violent confrontations involving Roman garrisons. The revolt quickly escalated beyond localized unrest. Roman forces were expelled from Jerusalem, and revolutionary leadership emerged within the city. Rome responded decisively. The Emperor Nero dispatched the general Vespasian to suppress the rebellion. Vespasian arrived in the eastern provinces in 67 AD, accompanied by experienced legions. The Roman strategy focused on isolating Jerusalem by subduing the surrounding regions before confronting the city itself. Roman campaigns progressed systematically through Galilee, Perea, and Judea. Towns and villages were captured, fortified positions dismantled, and resistance eliminated. The Roman advance resulted in widespread destruction and population displacement. By 68 AD, most of Judea outside Jerusalem had been brought under Roman control. In 68 AD, political developments in Rome interrupted the campaign. Nero's death triggered a period of instability known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Vespasian temporarily suspended operations while events unfolded in the capital. In 69 AD, Vespasian was proclaimed emperor. Command of the Judean campaign passed to his son, Titus. Titus resumed operations against Jerusalem in 70 AD. At the time, Jerusalem was densely populated, with large numbers of pilgrims present for religious festivals. The city was also internally divided, with competing factions controlling different areas. These internal conflicts weakened coordinated defense and intensified suffering during the siege. The Roman siege of Jerusalem followed standard military practice. Roman forces constructed encampments and siege works, including a circumvallation wall to cut off supplies. Over several months, starvation and disease spread within the city. Roman assaults gradually breached the city's defenses. In 70 AD, Roman forces captured Jerusalem. The temple complex was destroyed during the final phase of the assault. The destruction of the temple marked the end of the sacrificial system that had been central to Jewish religious life for centuries. Large sections of the city were burned or dismantled. Surviving inhabitants were killed, enslaved, or displaced. The fall of Jerusalem was not merely a military defeat. It represented the collapse of the primary institutional center of Second Temple Judaism. Temple-based leadership structures ceased to function. Priesthood, pilgrimage, and sacrificial worship could no longer operate in their traditional form. For the Jesus-following movement, the consequences were profound. The movement's earliest leadership and symbolic center had been located in Jerusalem. With the city's destruction, this center was eliminated. Any authority derived from proximity to the temple or to Jerusalem-based leadership was irreversibly weakened. The destruction of Jerusalem did not target the Jesus followers specifically. Roman action was directed against the revolt as a whole. Nevertheless, the movement was deeply affected by the loss of its geographic and institutional anchor. The Jerusalem community was scattered or destroyed along with the broader population. Following 70 AD, the demographic and organizational center of the Jesus-following movement shifted decisively toward Gentile-majority communities in the Roman provinces. Communities in Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome assumed greater prominence. These communities had already developed local leadership structures and practices that did not depend on the temple. The loss of Jerusalem also altered the movement's relationship to Jewish institutions. Temple participation was no longer possible. Jewish groups across the Roman world faced the challenge of redefining religious life without the temple. Different responses emerged, including the development of synagogue-centered practices and new forms of legal interpretation. Within this context, Jesus-following communities increasingly diverged from other Jewish groups. This divergence was not immediate or uniform, but the shared institutional framework that had once linked them no longer existed. The destruction of the temple removed a common point of reference. The war also affected the preservation and transmission of tradition. Oral teaching remained important, but the loss of Jerusalem heightened the perceived need to preserve memory in more durable forms. Communities now separated by distance and circumstance faced the risk of fragmentation without shared reference points. Roman authorities emerged from the conflict with reinforced control over Judea. Jerusalem was left largely in ruins. A Roman garrison remained in the region to prevent renewed rebellion. Judea's political autonomy, already limited, was eliminated. By 70 AD, the conditions that had defined the movement's earliest decades no longer existed. The movement that survived did so in altered form, shaped by displacement, dispersion, and the absence of its original institutional center. This moment marks a historical rupture. It did not create Christianity in its later sense, but it permanently transformed the environment in which the movement developed. Authority shifted away from Jerusalem. Practices adapted to new realities. The movement's future would be determined outside the land where it began. After 70 AD, the historical environment in which the Jesus-following movement had originated no longer existed. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple eliminated the movement's original geographic, institutional, and symbolic center. What remained was a dispersed network of communities operating across the Roman world, now required to sustain continuity without a shared sacred site or centralized leadership. The immediate effect of this rupture was organizational decentralization. Communities in Syria, Asia Minor, Egypt, Greece, and Rome assumed greater relative importance. These assemblies had already developed local leadership and patterns of instruction during the preceding decades. After 70 AD, they functioned without reference to Jerusalem as an active authority. At the same time, the generation with direct personal memory of Jesus' activity and execution began to diminish. Some eyewitnesses were likely still alive, but their authority was increasingly mediated through teaching rather than personal presence. This shift altered how tradition was transmitted. Oral instruction remained primary, but memory now competed with distance, dispersion, and the passage of time. The decades following 70 AD, therefore, marked a transition from witness-based authority to tradition-based authority. This was not a sudden change, but a gradual process shaped by practical necessity. Communities separated by geography required stable forms of instruction that could be preserved and shared. It is within this context that the earliest narrative accounts of Jesus' life began to take shape. The composition of what later became the canonical Gospels occurred during this period, most plausibly between c. 70 and 100 AD. While precise dating remains debated, there is broad scholarly agreement on this general range. The Gospel of Mark is commonly dated to shortly after the destruction of Jerusalem, around 70 AD. Its narrative reflects a community processing loss, disruption, and uncertainty. References to conflict, suffering, and the destruction of sacred space are embedded within its presentation of Jesus' activity. The text does not assume a temple-centered world. It reflects a reality in which that world has already collapsed. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke, generally dated between 80 and 90 AD, build upon earlier traditions while addressing different community contexts. Both incorporate material found in Mark, along with additional teachings and narratives. These texts reflect communities engaged with Jewish scripture while also addressing the presence of Gentile adherents. Their composition indicates sustained interaction with Jewish interpretive traditions alongside growing differentiation. The Gospel of John, often dated toward the end of the 1st century, presents a distinct narrative structure and theological emphasis. Its language and themes suggest a community with a longer history of internal reflection and external tension. Despite these differences, it remains rooted in the same historical figure and shared memory. These texts were not written as detached biographies. They functioned as instructional narratives, shaped by the needs of specific communities. Their authors selected, arranged, and interpreted tradition in ways that addressed local concerns. This does not negate their historical value, but it defines their purpose. During this period, there was no fixed collection of authoritative writings. Individual communities possessed individual texts. Some may have had access to more than one gospel. Others relied primarily on oral instruction. The process by which certain texts gained wider recognition had not yet begun in an organized form. The production of written narratives introduced a new dynamic. Once recorded, traditions became more stable, but also more open to comparison. Differences in emphasis, chronology, and interpretation were preserved rather than resolved. Diversity was now embedded in text. At the same time, the movement's relationship to Judaism continued to evolve. The destruction of the temple affected all Jewish groups, not only the Jesus followers. In the decades after 70 AD, Jewish communities reorganized religious life around study, interpretation, and communal practice rather than sacrifice. This process later came to be associated with rabbinic authority, though such structures were still developing during this period. Jesus-following communities participated in this broader Jewish transformation, but they did so in increasingly distinctive ways. Continued belief in Jesus' role differentiated them from other Jewish groups. At the same time, many practices and interpretive methods remained shared. Separation was uneven and gradual, not formalized or uniform. Roman authorities remained largely indifferent to these developments. After the war, Judea was tightly controlled, but Jesus-following communities outside Judea did not attract systematic attention. They continued to function within the legal ambiguity that characterized Jewish associations in the empire. Leadership structures during this period remained local and varied. Some communities were guided by groups of elders. Others relied on teachers, itinerant figures, or prominent patrons. There was no universal model. Authority derived from experience, teaching ability, and recognition rather than office. The written narratives produced during this period did not replace oral tradition immediately. They supplemented it. Public reading, memorization, and instruction remained central to communal life. Literacy levels varied, and texts were mediated through communal use rather than private reading. By c. 100 AD, the Jesus-following movement had achieved a degree of textual self-definition. Core narratives about Jesus' life, teaching, execution, and significance circulated in written form. These texts provided continuity across distance and time, but they did not impose uniformity. The movement at this stage cannot yet be described as a single, unified institution. It consisted of multiple communities, connected by shared memory and evolving tradition, but differentiated by practice, emphasis, and organization. What distinguishes this period is the stabilization of identity through narrative. The shift from living memory to recorded tradition allowed the movement to survive the loss of its original center. At the same time, it preserved differences that would later become sources of dispute. By the end of the 1st century, the foundational elements for later conflict were firmly in place. Written texts now carried authority. Communities had developed distinct habits and interpretations. Leadership remained decentralized. By the opening decades of the 2nd century AD, the Jesus-following movement no longer existed as a loosely connected extension of 1st century Jewish communities. It had become a set of overlapping but competing movements, distributed across the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, operating without a central authority capable of enforcing uniformity. This period is best understood not as the emergence of a single Christianity, but as the coexistence of multiple Christianities. These movements shared certain texts, names, and symbols, but differed in interpretation, practice, and structure. Diversity was not a deviation from an original unity. It was the historical condition of the movement at this stage. Geographically, communities were now well established in Syria, Asia Minor, Egypt, Greece, Italy, and North Africa. These regions differed in language, culture, and social organization. Greek was dominant in most Eastern communities, while Latin usage increased in the West. This linguistic diversity shaped how texts were read and transmitted. One significant strand consisted of Jewish Christian communities. These groups continued to observe Jewish law, including dietary practices and festival observance, while maintaining allegiance to Jesus. They were most visible in Syria and parts of Palestine. Their existence demonstrates that separation from Judaism was neither immediate nor universal. Alongside them were communities shaped primarily by Gentile membership. These groups often operated with minimal engagement in Jewish ritual life. Their practices reflected local social norms and were shaped by earlier missionary activity in the Roman world. Over time, these communities became numerically dominant. A further development during this period was the emergence of Gnostic teachers and systems. These movements are difficult to define precisely because they were not uniform. What they shared was an emphasis on revealed knowledge as the means of salvation and a tendency to reinterpret the figure of Jesus within broader cosmological frameworks. Gnostic groups produced their own texts, many of which survive through later discoveries. These writings present alternative narratives of Jesus' significance and alternative accounts of creation and redemption. They circulated alongside other Christian texts and were used in teaching and instruction within particular communities. Another major development was the activity of Marcion of Sinope, whose influence can be dated to c. 140 AD. Marcion operated primarily in Rome, one of the largest and most influential Christian centers of the period. He proposed a sharply defined interpretation of Christian identity that rejected the Hebrew Scriptures entirely. Marcion distinguished between the God of the Hebrew Scriptures and the God proclaimed by Jesus, presenting them as separate beings. He produced a collection of authoritative writings consisting of an edited version of the Gospel of Luke and selected Pauline letters. This collection functioned as a closed canon, one of the earliest known attempts to define authoritative Christian scripture. Marcion's activity did not occur on the margins. He established communities and gained followers across multiple regions. His success forced other Christian leaders to respond. Disagreement with Marcion was not only theological but structural. It raised urgent questions about which texts were authoritative and how continuity with Jewish scripture should be understood. During this same period, figures such as Ignatius of Antioch, writing around 110 AD, addressed fragmentation within communities. Ignatius' letters emphasize unity under a single local leader and warn against alternative teachings. His concerns indicate that diversity and competition were already visible and disruptive. The existence of competing movements meant that no single interpretation could claim universal recognition. Texts circulated without standardization. Teaching authority depended on local recognition rather than universal endorsement. Communities defined themselves in contrast to others. Roman authorities continued to view these movements as variations within Jewish or philosophical associations rather than as a unified threat. There is no evidence of a systematic imperial policy directed specifically at Christians during this period. Where conflict occurred, it was local and sporadic. Socially, these communities included a mix of artisans, merchants, freed persons, and some individuals of higher status. They met in private homes or rented spaces. There were no dedicated religious buildings. Community life centered on shared meals, instruction, and mutual support. The competition among movements was not primarily violent. It unfolded through teaching, writing, and boundary making. Groups defined themselves by rejecting the interpretations of others. Terms such as false teaching and error began to appear with greater frequency in surviving texts. Importantly, this competition did not yet produce permanent institutional separation. Communities were fluid. Individuals moved between groups. Texts were shared, borrowed, and adapted. Lines of division were visible but not yet fixed. By 150 AD, however, the trajectory was clear. Diversity had become entrenched. Attempts to impose unity through persuasion rather than enforcement were underway. The groundwork was being laid for the later development of formal orthodoxy and heresy. This period marks a critical stage in the history of Christian origins and early schisms. The movement's identity was being negotiated in real time through competing claims about authority, scripture, and interpretation. Between the early 2nd century and the late 170s AD, the Jesus-following movement entered a phase defined not by expansion alone, but by institutional response to internal competition. Instead, certain communities began to develop mechanisms intended to regulate teaching, stabilize leadership, and define boundaries. Authority was not inherited from the 1st century. It was constructed during this period under pressure. The need for authority arose from practical circumstances. Communities were geographically dispersed, textually diverse, and socially varied. Teachers traveled between cities. Writings circulated without standardization. Disagreement over interpretation was routine. Without a central institution, local communities faced the challenge of maintaining continuity while distinguishing themselves from rival interpretations. One response was the consolidation of local leadership. By the early 2nd century, evidence from multiple regions indicates a move toward a clearer distinction between leaders and congregations. This development did not occur uniformly or simultaneously. It emerged unevenly, shaped by local conditions and prior practices. A key source for this development is the correspondence of Ignatius of Antioch, written around 110 AD while he was traveling under guard to Rome. Ignatius' letters address communities in Asia Minor and emphasize unity under a single local leader, assisted by subordinate figures. He presents this structure as a safeguard against division and unauthorized teaching. Ignatius did not invent this model, nor did he describe it as universal. His letters reflect one approach among several competing models of organization. Nevertheless, they provide early evidence for the emergence of monoepiscopal leadership, in which one individual exercised primary oversight within a community. This model contrasted with earlier arrangements in which authority was shared among groups of elders or teachers. The shift towards singular oversight was gradual and contested. Its adoption depended on acceptance by the local community rather than external enforcement. Alongside leadership consolidation, communities also began to articulate criteria for legitimate teaching. Appeals to continuity became more prominent. Teachers claimed legitimacy by tracing their instruction to earlier figures or established communities. The idea that correct teaching must be linked to recognized predecessors gained traction during this period. This emphasis on continuity did not imply uniformity of content. Different communities preserved different traditions. However, the principle that authority is derived from continuity rather than innovation became increasingly important. Teaching that could not be anchored in recognized transmission was more likely to be rejected. The problem of textual diversity intensified these concerns. By the mid-2nd century, multiple writings circulated under the names of apostles and early figures. Some texts were narrative accounts, others collections of sayings, letters, or interpretive works. Communities did not agree on which texts were authoritative. The activity of Marcion accelerated the urgency of this issue. His use of a closed collection of writings forced other communities to consider how texts should be evaluated and preserved. Opposition to Marcion did not produce immediate consensus, but it sharpened the question of Scripture. During this period, communities increasingly distinguished between writings used for instruction and those considered authoritative. This process was not formalized. No council or decree defined a canon. Instead, texts gained authority through repeated use, perceived reliability, and compatibility with established teaching. Another important figure in this process was Irenaeus of Lyons, active in the latter half of the 2nd century and writing around 180 AD. Irenaeus addressed what he regarded as false teaching by arguing for the coherence and continuity of what he termed the rule of faith. His work provides insight into how authority was being conceptualized. Irenaeus emphasized 3 interrelated elements: recognized leadership, continuity of teaching, and a limited set of authoritative writings. He did not invent these ideas, but he articulated them systematically. His arguments were directed against Gnostic teachers and other alternative interpretations circulating in his time. In Irenaeus' framework, legitimate teaching was linked to communities that could demonstrate continuity with earlier instruction. This continuity was not demonstrated through documentation alone, but through stable leadership and consistent teaching over time. Authority was thus institutional as well as textual. Irenaeus also appealed to a plurality of gospels, identifying 4 as authoritative. This claim reflects an emerging consensus rather than an established rule. It shows that by the late 2nd century, some communities were beginning to limit the range of acceptable narratives while still acknowledging diversity within those limits. The emphasis on leadership, continuity, and limited textual authority did not eliminate competing movements. Gnostic teachers continued to operate. Jewish Christian communities persisted. Alternative interpretations remained active. What changed was the framework within which disputes were conducted. Disagreement increasingly took the form of boundary definition. Rather than debating individual points in isolation, communities began to classify entire systems of teaching as acceptable or unacceptable. This shift marked a significant development in the history of early schisms. The development of authority was also shaped by external pressures. Roman society placed value on stability, order, and continuity. Associations perceived as fragmented or disorderly attracted suspicion. Communities that could present themselves as structured and disciplined were better positioned to survive. At the same time, persecution remained sporadic and localized. There was no empire-wide policy targeting Christians during most of this period. However, local conflicts and legal proceedings reminded communities of their vulnerability. These experiences reinforced the perceived need for internal cohesion. Social factors also played a role. As communities grew in size and complexity, informal structures became less effective. The presence of wealthier members, patrons, and property introduced practical concerns about administration and discipline. Clear leadership facilitated coordination and accountability. Despite these developments, it is important to note what authority did not yet entail. There was no centralized church governing multiple regions. There was no universal creed enforced across communities. Leadership remained local, and recognition remained mutual rather than hierarchical. Communication between communities occurred through letters, visits, and shared texts. Influential centers such as Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria exercised greater informal influence due to size and connectivity, but they did not possess formal jurisdiction over others. The language used to describe authority during this period reflects experimentation rather than finality. Terms for leaders varied. Roles overlapped. Functions were defined by practice rather than by codified office. What later centuries would treat as fixed structures were still fluid. By 180 AD, However, the direction of development was clear. Communities that emphasized structured leadership, continuity of teaching, and selective use of texts were gaining prominence. These features provided stability in an environment of diversity and competition. This process did not produce unity. Instead, it institutionalized division. As some communities defined themselves through specific criteria of legitimacy, others were excluded. Schism became structural rather than incidental. The construction of authority during this period laid the foundation for later developments. Once authority could be claimed, contested, and defended, it could also be enforced. The mechanisms developed between 110 and 180 AD would later be adapted to new political conditions. This period, therefore, represents a turning point. The Jesus-following movement was no longer defined solely by shared memory or competing interpretation. It was increasingly shaped by institutions designed to regulate belief and practice. By the opening decades of the 3rd century AD, the Jesus-following movement had developed recognizable local institutions without possessing a centralized authority. The structures that emerged in the late 2nd century, local leadership, selective use of texts, and claims of continuity, were now tested under new pressures. These pressures were not primarily theological. They were administrative, legal, and disciplinary, shaped by the movement's interaction with Roman power and by internal disagreements over authority and practice. Christian communities by this time were established across North Africa, Italy, Gaul, Egypt, Asia Minor, and Syria. Their social composition varied. Many members belonged to urban artisan and merchant classes. Some communities included individuals of considerable wealth. Meetings took place in private homes or adapted spaces. There were still no purpose-built public churches in most regions, though some communities owned property by the early 3rd century. Roman law did not initially target Christians as a distinct category. There was no empire-wide statute banning Christianity. Instead, Christians were vulnerable under existing legal principles that regulated unauthorized associations, refusal to participate in public cults, and disobedience to imperial commands. Enforcement depended on local governors and circumstances rather than uniform policy. This legal ambiguity produced inconsistent outcomes. In some regions, Christian communities functioned openly for extended periods. In others, they faced harassment, interrogation, or punishment. These experiences varied significantly by province and by governor. A major shift occurred during the reign of Emperor Decius. In 250 AD, Decius issued an empire-wide edict requiring inhabitants of the Roman Empire to perform a public act of sacrifice to the traditional gods and to the emperor's well-being. Compliance was verified through certificates issued by local officials. The edict was not explicitly anti-Christian, but it placed Christians in a position of direct conflict with imperial expectations. The Decian Edict represented the first systematic attempt to enforce religious conformity across the empire. For Christian communities, it posed an immediate and practical dilemma. Participation in sacrifice contradicted established practice. Refusal carried legal consequences, including imprisonment, confiscation of property, or execution. Responses varied. Some Christians complied under pressure. Others refused and were punished. Still others fled or attempted to evade enforcement. The result was not only suffering, but internal division. Communities now faced the question of how to treat those who had complied with the edict after the crisis had passed. The Decian persecution was relatively brief, ending with Decius' death in 251 AD. but its impact was lasting. It exposed fault lines within Christian communities over discipline, forgiveness, and authority. The problem of the lapsee, those who had lapsed under pressure, became a central issue. In North Africa, these tensions developed into a major schism. The controversy, later known as Donatism, emerged from disputes over the legitimacy of clergy who had complied with imperial demands. The central question was whether sacraments performed by such clergy were valid. The Donatist position insisted on the moral purity of church leadership and rejected the authority of bishops who had compromised under persecution. Their opponents argued for the restoration of unity and the efficacy of sacraments regardless of the personal conduct of the clergy. This disagreement was not abstract. It involved property, leadership, and communal allegiance. The Donatist controversy illustrates how discipline became a structural issue. Competing communities claimed to represent the true continuation of the church. Each side organized leadership, worship, and instruction independently. This was not a temporary dispute, but a durable regional division. Meanwhile, further persecution occurred under Emperor Valerian between 257 and 260 AD. Valerian's measures targeted clergy and prohibited Christian assemblies. Bishops were exiled or executed, and property was confiscated. Like the Decian persecution, these measures were enforced unevenly and ended abruptly with Valerian's capture by Persian forces in 260 AD. The cumulative effect of these persecutions was significant. Christian communities gained experience in managing crises, maintaining networks under pressure, and negotiating their relationship with imperial authority. Leadership structures were tested and, in many cases, strengthened. After 260 AD, the empire entered a period of relative tolerance toward Christians under Gallienus, who issued rescripts restoring confiscated property. For several decades, Christian communities operated with minimal interference, particularly in the eastern provinces. During this period, internal organization continued to develop. Regional networks of bishops became more visible. Communication between communities increased. Disputes were sometimes addressed through gatherings of local leaders, though these assemblies did not yet possess universal authority. Textual use also continued to stabilize. While no formal canon existed, patterns of reading and citation became more consistent. Certain texts were widely used across regions, while others remained localized. Disagreement persisted, but the range of accepted writings narrowed. At the same time, Christianity became more visible in urban life. The number of adherents increased. Public identification became more common. This visibility brought both opportunity and risk. Communities attracted converts, but also scrutiny. A final and severe phase of persecution began under Emperor Diocletian in 303 AD. This period, often referred to as the Great Persecution, involved a series of edicts aimed at suppressing Christian practice. Churches were ordered destroyed, scriptures confiscated, and clergy arrested. Participation in sacrifice was again enforced. The Great Persecution differed from earlier measures in scale and coordination, though enforcement still varied by region. In the western provinces, implementation was often limited. In the Eastern Empire, enforcement was more rigorous and sustained. Once again, Christian communities faced internal challenges. The treatment of those who complied under pressure became a point of contention. The question of authority, who could forgive, who could lead, and on what basis, reappeared with renewed intensity. The Great Persecution ended gradually. By 311 AD, imperial policy shifted. Galerius, one of the architects of the persecution, issued an edict of toleration acknowledging the failure of the effort and permitting Christians to exist under certain conditions. 2 years later, in 313 AD, the political landscape changed decisively. Constantine and Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, granting Christians legal toleration and restoring confiscated property. This act did not make Christianity the official religion of the empire, but it removed the legal vulnerability that had shaped the previous century. The period from 200 to 313 AD thus represents a critical phase in the history of early Christian schisms. Persecution did not create unity. Instead, it intensified internal differentiation. Communities responded differently to pressure. Regional practices solidified. Disagreements over discipline became institutionalized. At the same time, persecution forced communities to articulate principles of authority and legitimacy more clearly. Leadership was no longer a matter of teaching alone. It involved managing property, representing the community to authorities, and maintaining cohesion under threat. By the eve of legalization, Christianity existed as a network of regionally distinct communities with established leadership, shared but not identical textual traditions, and unresolved internal divisions. These divisions were no longer incidental. They were embedded in structures that would persist into the next phase. The end of persecution did not resolve these differences. Instead, it transformed the conditions under which they would be addressed. With imperial power now available as an ally, the mechanisms developed under pressure would be repurposed in new ways. By the early 4th century, the Roman Empire had undergone profound political and administrative change. The period of instability that characterized the 3rd century had given way to new forms of imperial consolidation. Christianity entered this transformed environment not as a marginal association, but as a network of communities that had survived persecution and developed internal structures capable of collective action. The turning point occurred in 313 AD, when Constantine and Licinius, the two senior emperors following the collapse of the tetrarchic system, issued what later tradition termed the Edict of Milan. This measure granted legal toleration to Christians and restored property confiscated during the Great Persecution. It did not establish Christianity as the state religion, nor did it grant exclusive privileges. It removed legal penalties and placed Christianity within the category of permitted religious associations. This act altered the legal status of Christian communities across the empire. For the first time, they could own property openly, assemble without fear of prosecution, and seek legal redress. Clergy were no longer subject to arrest solely for their religious role. Confiscated meeting spaces and lands were ordered returned where possible. The consequences of legalization were immediate and structural. Communities that had previously operated discreetly could now function publicly. Resources that had been hidden or dispersed could be consolidated. Leadership figures emerged into visibility, not as clandestine organizers, but as recognized representatives of their communities. Constantine's support for Christianity was not abstract. He extended imperial patronage through financial assistance, legal exemptions, and symbolic endorsement. Christian leaders were exempted from certain civic obligations. Churches received imperial funds for construction and restoration. These measures elevated the social standing of Christian institutions within urban life. At the same time, legalization did not eliminate internal divisions. The disagreements that had developed during the period of persecution remained unresolved. In some regions, such as North Africa, the Donatist controversy continued unabated. Competing communities claimed legitimacy, property, and recognition. For the first time, these internal disputes attracted imperial attention. Constantine viewed religious unity as a component of political stability. Fragmentation within a legally recognized religion posed administrative challenges. The emperor's interest in Christian affairs was therefore pragmatic rather than theological. Constantine intervened in disputes not as a doctrinal authority, but as an arbiter seeking order. In the Donatist conflict, he convened councils, heard appeals, and ultimately enforced decisions through imperial authority. This marked a significant shift. Questions that had once been resolved through persuasion or separation were now subject to state enforcement. This development introduced a new dynamic into Christian history. Authority was no longer only local or communal. It could now be backed by imperial power. Decisions made by councils, when supported by the emperor, carried legal consequences. The most significant doctrinal conflict to emerge during this period arose in Alexandria in the early 320s AD. The dispute centered on the teachings of Arius, a presbyter, and concerned the relationship between God the Father and the Son. Arius argued that the Son was not eternal in the same sense as the Father, and that there was a point at which the Son did not exist. His opponents maintained that the Son was eternal and shared fully in the divine nature. This disagreement was not merely semantic. It touched on fundamental questions about worship, authority, and the nature of salvation. The dispute spread rapidly beyond Alexandria. Bishops across the eastern provinces took sides. Letters circulated. Communities became divided. What had begun as a local disagreement escalated into an empire-wide controversy. Constantine perceived this division as a threat to stability. In response, he convened a council of bishops to address the issue. This gathering, later known as the Council of Nicaea, met in 325 AD in the city of Nicaea in Bithynia. The Council of Nicaea was unprecedented in scale. Bishops from across the empire were invited, particularly from the eastern provinces. Estimates of attendance vary, but several hundred bishops participated. The council was convened by imperial authority, financed by the emperor, and conducted under his patronage. Constantine did not preside as a theologian. His role was to facilitate agreement and enforce outcomes. The theological debate itself was conducted by bishops and theologians who brought with them diverse traditions and vocabularies. The central outcome of the council was the formulation of a creedal statement addressing the disputed issues. The creed affirmed that the Son was of the same substance as the Father, using the Greek term homoousios. This term was not drawn directly from Scripture, but was adopted to clarify the council's position. The adoption of this language was controversial even among those opposed to Arius. Its use reflected the council's attempt to produce a clear and enforceable statement rather than a purely scriptural summary. The goal was not theological nuance, but doctrinal closure. The council also issued canons addressing administrative matters, including the regulation of episcopal authority and the timing of Easter. These decisions illustrate that the council functioned not only as a doctrinal forum, but as an administrative assembly. Following the council, those who refused to accept its decisions faced consequences. Arius was condemned and exiled. His supporters were removed from office. For the first time, doctrinal disagreement carried legal penalties imposed by imperial authority. However, the Council of Nicaea did not resolve the controversy permanently. Many bishops accepted the creed under pressure or for pragmatic reasons. Others rejected or reinterpreted its language. In the years following 325 AD, disputes over its meaning continued. What had changed was the framework of disagreement. Doctrine was no longer contested solely through teaching and persuasion. It was now defined by councils convened under imperial authority and enforced by law. This transformation had long-term implications. The mechanisms developed during this period: imperial convocation of councils, creedal formulation, and legal enforcement, would shape the future of Christian divisions. Unity was now pursued through institutional power rather than voluntary consensus. The period from 313 to 325 AD thus represents a decisive shift in the history of Christian origins and early schisms. Christianity moved from legal vulnerability to legal recognition. Internal disagreements moved from local management to imperial adjudication. This shift did not eliminate diversity. It altered the consequences of diversity. Disagreement now risked exile, deposition, or loss of legal standing. The stakes of doctrine increased dramatically. By the end of this phase, Christianity had entered a new era. It was no longer simply a network of communities negotiating identity internally. It had become an institution operating within the structures of imperial power. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD did not conclude the doctrinal conflict it was convened to resolve. Instead, it initiated a prolonged period in which theological disagreement, ecclesiastical authority, and imperial power became inseparably linked. From this point forward, disputes that had once been managed locally were adjudicated through a combination of councils, imperial decrees, and administrative enforcement. In the years immediately following Nicaea, the status of the Nicene Creed remained unstable. Although the council affirmed that the Son was of the same substance, homoousios, as the Father, agreement on the interpretation and implications of this term was far from universal. Some bishops accepted the creed while questioning its language. Others rejected it outright. Theological positions did not align neatly with geography or institutional rank. Imperial involvement intensified rather than receded. Constantine, though responsible for convening Nicaea, did not consistently enforce its conclusions. In subsequent years, he recalled bishops who had been exiled and allowed alternative formulations to circulate. This inconsistency reflected both political calculation and the complexity of the theological landscape. Unity was desired, but consensus proved elusive. After Constantine died in 337 AD, the empire was divided among his sons. Imperial policy toward Christian doctrine varied according to the convictions and priorities of each ruler. In the eastern provinces, emperors such as Constantius II favored positions that differed from the Nicene formulation. Councils convened under imperial authority produced creeds that avoided or reinterpreted homoousios. This period saw a proliferation of councils and synods, particularly in the Eastern Empire. These gatherings attempted to clarify doctrine, but they often produced competing statements rather than resolution. Bishops were deposed, reinstated, and exiled with regularity. Authority became increasingly dependent on imperial favor rather than solely on ecclesiastical standing. The repeated deposition and restoration of bishops had practical consequences. Local communities experienced frequent leadership changes imposed from above. Loyalty to a particular theological position is often aligned with loyalty to a particular bishop. As a result, Doctrinal conflict translated directly into institutional instability. A central figure during this period was Athanasius of Alexandria, a strong defender of the Nicene position. Athanasius was exiled multiple times under different emperors. His career illustrates how theological commitment and imperial politics intersected. His opponents used imperial mechanisms to remove him, while his supporters relied on shifting political circumstances for his return. These cycles of exile and restoration demonstrate that orthodoxy during this period was not defined by theological agreement alone. It was enforced or suspended through administrative action. Councils issued decisions, but emperors determined whether those decisions carried practical force. The role of law in shaping Christian doctrine became increasingly explicit. Imperial edicts regulated assemblies, defined legitimate leadership, and restricted the activities of those deemed heretical. Disagreement was no longer merely a matter of teaching. It carried legal consequences. At the same time, Christianity's public presence expanded dramatically. Churches were constructed with imperial support. Clergy assumed visible roles in civic life. Bishops acted as mediators, administrators, and legal representatives for their communities. The integration of church leadership into imperial society reinforced the importance of doctrinal alignment with state policy. By the mid-4th century, theological disagreement had produced enduring divisions within the Christian world. Communities aligned themselves with particular creedal formulations. Labels such as Arian and Nicene, though often imprecise, became markers of affiliation. These divisions were not merely intellectual, they structured communal life. The reign of Julian, known later as the Apostate, briefly altered this trajectory. From 361 to 363 AD, Julian attempted to reverse Constantine's policies by withdrawing imperial support from Christianity and promoting traditional religious practices. He allowed exiled bishops of all factions to return, not to restore unity, but to encourage division. Julian's policy demonstrated how dependent ecclesiastical stability had become on imperial favor. His death in 363 AD ended this experiment. Subsequent emperors restored Christian patronage, reinforcing the link between imperial authority and ecclesiastical order. The decisive shift occurred under Theodosius I, who ruled from 379 to 395 AD. Theodosius aligned himself firmly with the Nicene position. Unlike his predecessors, he pursued doctrinal uniformity through explicit legal measures. In 380 AD, Theodosius issued an edict declaring Nicene Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. This decree did not merely favor one interpretation, it delegitimized others. Only those who adhered to the Nicene formulation were recognized as legitimate Christians under the law. This legal definition of orthodoxy marked a turning point. Doctrine was no longer contested within a neutral legal framework. It was now enforced by the state. Those outside the sanctioned position lost legal recognition, access to property, and the right to assemble publicly. To consolidate this policy, Theodosius convened the Council of Constantinople in 381 AD. This council reaffirmed the Nicene Creed and expanded its scope, particularly in relation to the Holy Spirit. It also addressed issues of ecclesiastical hierarchy, granting increased prominence to the Bishop of Constantinople due to the city's imperial status. The Council of Constantinople did not introduce new principles. It formalized and enforced developments that had unfolded over decades. Its authority derived not only from episcopal agreement, but from imperial backing. The council's decisions were integrated into law. Following 381 AD, enforcement intensified. Bishops who opposed the Nicene position were removed from office. Churches were transferred to Nicene leadership. Alternative assemblies were prohibited. Imperial officials were instructed to implement these measures. This enforcement did not eliminate dissent. Instead, it transformed dissent into a legal and political problem. Communities that rejected the Nicene settlement were marginalized, sometimes forced to operate clandestinely or outside imperial boundaries. The relationship between church and state during this period was reciprocal. Emperors used doctrinal unity to support political stability. Church leaders relied on imperial authority to enforce decisions. This mutual dependence reshaped both institutions. Importantly, the enforcement of orthodoxy did not produce uniform belief. It produced institutional uniformity within imperial structures. Agreement was often pragmatic. Compliance ensured access to property, protection, and influence. Resistance carries costs. By the end of the 4th century, the framework for defining and enforcing orthodoxy was firmly established. Councils convened by emperors defined doctrine. Law enforced compliance. Ecclesiastical authority was inseparable from imperial power. The period from 325 to 381 AD thus represents the transformation of doctrinal disagreement into a matter of state policy. What began as a theological dispute evolved into a legal regime governing belief and practice. This transformation had lasting consequences. Once doctrine could be enforced by law, disagreement could no longer be resolved through separation alone. It required submission, exile, or exclusion. The mechanisms developed during this period would shape subsequent divisions. By 381 AD, Christianity existed as a legally defined institution with an officially sanctioned doctrine. Those outside this definition were no longer simply alternative Christians. They were classified as heretics under imperial law. By 381 AD, Christianity had entered a new phase. The alignment of imperial authority with Nicene doctrine, formalized under Theodosius I, established a legal framework in which one version of Christian belief was recognized as legitimate within the Roman Empire. This framework did not end the disagreement. It altered how disagreement was managed and the consequences attached to it. Following the Council of Constantinople, 381 AD, imperial policy favored Nicene Christianity across the empire. Bishops who adhered to the council's formulations were installed in major urban centers. Churches and property were transferred to Nicene control. Alternative assemblies were restricted or prohibited under imperial law. These measures created institutional uniformity within imperial boundaries, but they did not eliminate theological diversity. The late 4th and early 5th centuries were marked by continued debate over issues that earlier councils had not fully resolved. The primary focus shifted from questions of the relationship between the Father and the Son to questions concerning the nature of Christ. Specifically, disputes arose over how Christ's divine and human aspects were related. These disputes were not abstract. They affected preaching, worship, and the interpretation of Scripture. They also intersected with regional theological traditions, linguistic differences, and long-standing rivalries between major ecclesiastical centers. Two cities played particularly prominent roles: Alexandria and Antioch. The theological traditions associated with these centers emphasized different approaches to understanding Christ. Alexandrian theologians tended to stress unity, focusing on the divine Word becoming flesh. Antiochene theologians emphasized distinction, focusing on the full reality of Christ's human experience. These approaches were not inherently incompatible, but they used different conceptual tools and vocabularies. When combined with political and institutional competition, these differences became points of conflict. The first major rupture of this period occurred at the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD. The immediate controversy centered on the teachings associated with Nestorius, who had become Bishop of Constantinople in 428 AD. Nestorius objected to certain formulations used in devotion, particularly the term Theotokos, God-bearer, for Mary. He argued that this language obscured the distinction between Christ's divine and human aspects. Opponents of Nestorius, led by Cyril of Alexandria, argued that rejecting Theotokos undermined the unity of Christ's person. The disagreement escalated rapidly. Letters circulated. Appeals were made to imperial authority. The Emperor Theodosius II convened a council to resolve the dispute. The Council of Ephesus opened in 431 AD amid intense political maneuvering. Delegations arrived at different times. Procedural decisions were contested. The council convened before all parties were present. Under the leadership of Cyril, the council condemned Nestorius and affirmed the use of Theotokos. Nestorius was deposed and later exiled. His supporters rejected the council's legitimacy, arguing that it had been conducted improperly. Attempts at reconciliation followed, but they did not restore unity. Communities associated with the Antiochene tradition, particularly in the eastern regions beyond direct imperial control, did not accept the council's outcome. This rejection resulted in a lasting institutional separation. Churches aligned with the teachings associated with Nestorius developed independently, particularly within the Persian Empire. Imperial enforcement within Roman territory marginalized these communities, but it could not eliminate them beyond imperial borders. The Council of Ephesus thus marked the first irreversible schism of the imperial Christian era. The separation was not merely theological. It was institutional, geographic, and political. Once enforced by imperial authority, it could not be undone through negotiation alone. 2 decades later, a second and even broader division occurred. The focus shifted to debates over how Christ's divine and human aspects were united. Some theologians, reacting against what they perceived as excessive division in earlier formulations, emphasized unity to the point of describing Christ as having a single nature after the incarnation. Opponents argued that this approach compromised the reality of Christ's humanity. The controversy intensified following the rise of Eutychus, a monastic leader whose teachings became associated with these views. Once again, appeals were made to imperial authority. The Emperor Marcian, seeking stability, convened a council in 451 AD at Chalcedon, near Constantinople. The Council of Chalcedon brought together a large number of bishops from across the empire. Its proceedings were closely monitored by imperial officials. The council produced a doctrinal statement known as the Definition of Chalcedon. This definition affirmed that Christ existed in 2 natures, divine and human, united without confusion, change, division, or separation. The language was carefully constructed to exclude extreme interpretations on both sides. The definition of Chalcedon was accepted by many bishops, particularly in the western provinces and in Constantinople. However, it was rejected by substantial Christian populations in Egypt, Syria, Armenia, and Ethiopia. These communities regarded the Chalcedonian formulation as inconsistent with their theological traditions. Imperial authorities enforced the council's decisions within Roman territory. Bishops who rejected Chalcedon were removed from office. Churches were transferred to Chalcedonian leadership. Resistance persisted despite enforcement. The result was the emergence of parallel ecclesiastical structures. Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian communities developed separate hierarchies, liturgical practices, and identities. These divisions were not temporary. They endured despite repeated attempts at compromise. By 451 AD, Christianity was no longer a single institutional body, even within the Roman Empire. Multiple traditions now existed with defined boundaries, established leadership, and competing claims to legitimacy. Imperial authority could enforce compliance within certain limits, but it could not restore unity. The cumulative effect of the councils from 381 to 451 AD was the fixing of Christian divisions. Earlier periods had seen fluidity and overlap. After Chalcedon, the major lines of division were institutionalized and durable. These divisions were reinforced by geography and politics. Communities outside direct imperial control, such as those in Persia, Armenia, and parts of Africa, developed with greater autonomy. Even within imperial borders, regional identities proved resilient. The process that began with attempts to define orthodoxy now resulted in permanent pluralism. Efforts to impose doctrinal unity through law had reached their limits. Further enforcement risked instability rather than cohesion. By the mid-5th century, the foundational period of Christian origins and early schisms had concluded. The movement that began as a Jewish group in 1st century Judea had become a set of distinct Christian traditions, each with its own institutional structures and theological commitments. After 451 AD, subsequent developments would occur within these established traditions. Later divisions, reforms, and controversies would build upon structures already in place. The formative era was over. The period from 30 AD to 451 AD thus constitutes a coherent historical arc. It begins with a localized movement under Roman rule and ends with a fragmented religious landscape shaped by imperial power, theological debate, and institutional enforcement. These outcomes were not the result of a single decision or council. They emerged through centuries of adaptation, conflict, and negotiation. By the time imperial authority could no longer enforce unity, division had become permanent.